Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Today I'll be looking at the first 5 EP releases from 1991, 3 Pulse EPs, plus releases by Aircut and Intelligent Communication. Indo Tribe and the future sound of London, the Pulse EP. Although the group's 1990 EPs have been a success, especially the Mental Cube one, a studio in North London wasn't cheap, and so Brian and Garry needed an income. They'd already realised that experimenting with different styles, they were able to justify putting out the tracks under numerous aliases. Each name and style also brought its own interests, so they were potentially able to build up a larger fan base and sales base by bringing out a wider range of sounds under a larger range of aliases. Nevertheless, with the huge success of October 1990's Mental Cube EP, things were on the up for Dougans and Cobain. Certainly on their first release for 1991, the first of 4 Pulse EPs, you can hear increased confidence. Building on the surging breakbeats and epic bleep techno of the previous release, the 4 tracks on this EP feature punchier beats, shinier production, bigger melodies, increased tempos and bolder ideas. The EP's biggest claim to fame, however, is the first appearance of the FSOL moniker. Side B features 2 tracks credited to the future sound of London, one of which would go on to appear on the band's debut album Accelerator at the end of the year. The name had been around for a while, but was kept aside for something really worthwhile. It was clear from the off that the alias would have to live up to its own bold statement. You can certainly hear that boldness on Pulse State, the pair's first truly epic track. The other side of the EP is provided by Indo Tribe, an alias that only ever appeared on the Pulse series, with no standalone releases to its name. The moniker had been used by Brian for a series of experimental recordings in the 80s, and re-adopted for this new project. Much like FSOL and Mental Cube, Indo Tribe was used for a wide range of styles and approaches, as opposed to the usually stylistically homogeneous use of aliases. The Pulse EP is also a milestone in the band's career for being the group's first release on Jumpin' and Pumpin'. JMP was another dance imprint owned by Passion Music, effectively a sister label to Debut, who'd released their previous 12 inches. For a while the pair released music on both labels, which provided different types of contracts, before eventually moving solely to JMP by the end of 1991. Garry described the label as run by a lovable barrow boy called Les, who worked behind a gold embroidered table with his name on it. Although a simple relationship of convenience, they were paid $750 to $1,000 for a 12-inch, the label would push it to DJs and they couldn't be asked to run their own label. It would end up being a hugely important connection, with FSOL Digital's physical releases in the 21st century being manufactured by Passion Music under the JMP banner. The credits are, as usual, somewhat intriguing, with mixed titles being given to all 4 tracks, and production duties being handled by both Mental Cube and Yage. Garry was still using his birth surname at this point. The front cover, stark black and white typography, is much simpler than the 1990 designs, and having used the Boogie G Riphead name for a single release, Mark McLean's credit is listed as an offbeat design. The Boogie name would return quickly. 3 further Pulse EPs would follow before the band signed to Virgin, and all 4 will be combined for a 2008 CD release called The Pulse EPs. Indo Tribe, Bring in the Pulse, MFK Mix. The first track released as Indo Tribe, Bring in the Pulse, kicks off 1991 with a bang. Hallelujah vocal samples, programmed drums, layers of bleeping and buzzing synth lines, Garry occasionally shouting the title. Everything was bigger, darker and louder than the 3 1990 12 inches. Perhaps inspired by the popularity of Q, the move away from clear sample loops into more overtly electronic sounds aligns them with the UK techno scene of the time, to mixed results. Much of the 1991 material feels slightly more anonymous among the huge amount of UK hardcore at the time, a lot of that released on Jumpin' and Pumpin', but it sounds so much more confident than tracks like AST. Bringing the Pulse is a prime example of that. It's quite a fun track, albeit one that's very much rooted in 1991. Indo Tribe, In the Mind of a Child, Firstborn Mix. The second Indo Tribe track picks up where the first left off, and moves even further into the bleep techno territory, ending up sounding like a close cousin of Q. The track could easily have been released as a follow-up Mental Cube single, and found success, but the band were already moving away from the tried and tested singles approach. We didn't really believe in tracks that solidly anyway, tracks were 10 a penny. Indeed, the track appeared 19 years later on the Mental Cube EP reissue, cited as originally being considered for release as a Mental Cube track. Garry pulled an all-nighter to work on it, much to the annoyance of the guy who actually lived in the studio next door, and was rewarded with a blown speaker from playing it too loud. The award for the year's best neighbour did not go to Mr. Cobain, but then again, if you're going to live in a studio... So yeah, bleeps, big punchy fall to the floor kicks, it's all good 1991 fun, continuing down a darker path and suited to release on Jumpin' and Pumpin'. It also appeared on 1992's Earthbeat compilation, minus its Firstborn mix addendum. Most of the tracks from this era had a mix title added, as was the fashion at the time. As with a lot of 91 material, very few obvious samples are present, so only a brief vocal yell reveals itself, although the descending synth sweep used throughout the track was later used at the end of the album version of Stolen Documents. A contemporary review described the track as containing phased washing machine acid sounds. I honestly don't know what that actually means, but I quite like it. The Future Sound of London Hardhead Frothing at the Mouth mix. As any fan knows, FSOL never do things the way you'd expect. Regardless of the linear nature of this series, there's no straight way to tell their story. Nowhere is this clearer than on the very first Future Sound of London track. It should be one of those mould-breaking tracks, an epic piece of spacey techno the band had set aside to be released by the name they would use for their most unconventional, and most successful, material. And it's not. Hardhead Frothing at the Mouth mix doesn't really sound like anything else they've released. Even the original mix from the Archives Volume 3 is much closer to the atmospheric, acidic sounds of their less conventional Jumpin' and Pumpin' era tracks. The archive version is known among fans as the original, but to confuse matters, Jumpin' and Pumpin' released this Frothing at the Mouth mix simply as Hardhead on the 1997 compilation Techno Explosion, meaning they're both kind of the original. There's definitely some UK hardcore in there, the cheeky bass melody, the incessant rave whistles, but also an odd Eastern sounding instrument sample and a couple of jazzy breakdown sections. It's not as disjointedly odd as something like 1992's Living for the Love, but the various elements do feel strangely assembled. When the jazzier aspects come to the fore, it's possible to hear the track as a forerunner to the rawer atmospherics of future releases like ISDN. There's a lovely little pause at 4 minutes 40 in which you can definitely hear FSOL, but on the whole it's quite a baffling track to kickstart the Future Sound of London legacy. Overall it feels much closer to something they might have put out as Smart Systems. Interestingly, it was the oldest piece on the EP, something they'd recorded some time before the rest of the tracks, perhaps explaining its slightly different sound to its fellow Pulse tracks. The Future Sound of London Pulse State 831am mix, also known simply as Pulse State. If Hardhead was technically the first Future Sound of London track, then Pulse State is the first to feel like one. Released at the start of 1991 on the first Pulse EP, it immediately stands out among the rest of the material from the era. A bleepy melodic techno epic with huge sweeping choral chords and an irresistible 303 bass line, the track is frequently cited as a highlight on Accelerator. It's hard to argue with, it's been my favourite on the album since first listen. Despite the insistent fall to the floor kick, Pulse State has always been just as at home on your stereo for some deep listening as on the dance floor, something that can't be said for a lot of the pair's tracks from the same era. Pulse State set a high bar for the FSOL name, and thankfully it's one they've continued to live up to. In contrast with In the Mind of a Child, Pulse State had Brian turning in an all-nighter, and he was inspired by watching Twin Peaks, which may well have gone on to help the final mix's dreamy feel. Aircut Visual Attack. Visual Attack can only be described as a very weird release. A very rare outing away from Earthbeat, the only other example from this period being the 2 American recordings on the B-side of So This Is Love. The 12-inch was effectively a collaboration with Pressure Zone, a techno duo comprised of Dave Clayton and Marco Perry, recorded at their Beat Farm studio and released on their Beat Farm Recordings label. The band connected with Beat Farm via Brian's old humanoid partner John Laker, and the collaboration was an invite from Perry. Armed with a sketch for a track they'd already been working on, which would later come out as Tingler by Smart Systems, they arrived at a surprisingly well kitted out basement studio in the seedier part of Soho. Laker helped out with production, and the group set up the gear and jammed out a live take of this new hardcore track. Midway through production, they were interrupted by a man hoping to find a brothel which had formerly occupied the same building. Berwick Street was an odd place, all record shops one end, red light district the other. Still, so far so relatively easy to comprehend. Where things get weird is the number of reissues and alternate versions that exist. Not only did the Beat Farm 12-inch get reissued with different label art, but the track itself would go on to be reissued in 92, 96 and 2009. This makes Visual Attack the most re-released track in the FSOL catalogue outside of Papua New Guinea and Stacker Humanoid. Not bad then, given that Aircut was never really a Dougans Cobain project. A second release from 91, Eternal, features neither FSOL member and is credited entirely to Clayton and Perry. 2009's Aircut EP opens with Visual Attack but concludes with 2 Clayton Perry tracks. On the subject of credits, Brian was credited as Dougans on the first Beat Farm release, while B-side Let It Take You was apparently co-produced by DJs Roy the Roach and Judge Jules. If this weren't all convoluted enough, there's also some confusion about the title of the original track itself, with versions listed as From the Home of the Humanoid, Humanoid Attack, Original Attack and Humanoid Mix. There are negligible variations between a couple of these versions, but they are for all intents and purposes the original version. Throw in the fact that the 1991 B-side Let It Take You is effectively a remix of the track, and the picture of confusion is complete. Visual Attack itself is a slice of breakbeat hardcore in the same vein as most Smart Systems material. No surprise then that the track was reissued in 2008 on By Any Other Name under the Smart Systems alias. Visual Attack, From the Home of the Humanoid, also known as Visual Attack, Original Attack. Everything you could want from a slice of Smart Systems-esque breakbeat hardcore is present, from hoovers to whistles, crowd noise and a brief emotive synth pad breakdown. It might be my favourite of all the band's hardcore tracks, possibly because of the lovely breakdown section, maybe because of how over the top the main synths get near the end. It's a lot of fun. Almost identical mixes have been released as Visual Attack Humanoid Attack and Visual Attack Humanoid Mix. The release and naming of this piece over the years has confused even the hardiest of FSOL fans. When first downloading these from Napster in 2000, I was very disappointed to find From the Home of the Humanoid and Original Attack mixes were identical, other than a touch of crowd noise at the end, and it's only since starting this series that I've actually identified the tenuous difference between this and 1992's Humanoid Attack. Spoiler, it's 4 additional bars in the latter. You'll want that version if you're after the mix that appeared on By Any Other Name, by the way. The voice sample stating proceed with the visual attack came from the 1984 film The Last Starfighter. Let It Take You. Let It Take You is a lovely curio that gives some insight into the Dougans Cobain working process. Instead of leaving Visual Attack and moving on to something completely new, they stripped the track down to its basics and used it as the starting point for a totally different piece. At various points, breakbeats, The Last Starfighter proceed with the Visual Attack voice sample, rave whistles and even the intense Hoover synth appear. And yet the track itself is a mellow, somewhat melancholic, slightly housey number led by an uncredited vocalist or sample singing the title. This approach of recycling and reimagining musical elements would reappear on late 91 and 92 singles and, most obviously, would lead to the multi-part single approach the band became known for throughout the decade. Being the type of listener I am, one who was no doubt musically closer to Garry than Brian in the 90s, Brian's aggressive and I'm sad, as he told Robotnik in 96. I'm enormously fond of the mournful chords and sense of longing in Let It Take You. It might even be my favourite track from the group's fruitful run of releases in 1991. The Future Sound of London, Smart Systems, Indo Tribe, Pulse 2. Expanding on the first Pulse EP, this second volume continues the world building and growing number of aliases that were the band's bread and butter at this time. By this point, the group were regular listeners of Colin Dale's Outer Limits show on Kiss FM, who was playing cutting-edge dance music of the time and wasn't afraid to throw in tracks from the weirder end of things. It being a popular show, Brian and Garry realised there was a potential audience there and, having already started making a name for themselves, began to send in dats of tracks before they'd even gone to press, thus managing to build up hype for releases before they'd even been promoted. Among these tracks were an FSOL piece called The Z Storm, which remains unreleased but has since appeared online, taped from the radio back in 91, and 1 in 8, which proved remarkably popular. The most immediate addition to the FSOL world on this release is the inclusion of the first track by Smart Systems, Dougans and Cobain's self-described intense industrial rave machine. Smart Systems would go on to be one of the few early projects to feature on numerous releases over the years, even providing occasional remix duties. FSOL and Indo Tribe returned from the first volume, resulting in 3 artists over 4 tracks, FSOL being the project to provide 2 of them. Both of these would end up on Accelerator and, in keeping with Pulse State from the previous EP, are more complex and mature sounding than the 2 ravier pieces accompanying them. To be fair, both Smart Systems and Indo Tribe tracks mark another step up in production, with more sections, layers and unusual sounds than earlier Alias tracks. Despite the reasons behind the continuing changing of names and high release rate, in Garry's words, we had to keep up the steady stream of releases to survive. This period of rapid and continual reinvention kept them on their toes, and gave them the opportunity to continue to up their game in the production stakes. For listeners, this period offered a rare chance to hear the development of the band's sound every couple of months. As with the first EP, all tracks feature mix titles, which were dropped by the time the 2 FSOL tracks made it to Accelerator. Unusually, the mix names are only present on the 12-inch labels, giving the rear sleeve a more conventional track list. Track 3 is listed as In 8 on the inner sleeve and In 8 on the label. Never let it be said they do things the easy way. The cover itself continues the black and white theme of the previous EP, but with much more involving graphics, a style of buggies that would be used on a large number of jumping and pumping 12 inches as this work began to prove very popular. More aliases and world building elements appear in the credits section. Luco is listed as a producer of Stolen Documents, while all the other tracks feature production by Mental Cube. Yage is absent again, with Mental Cube also providing engineering duties. The seemingly one-off credit of Luco, denoted with an asterisk, is particularly intriguing as it feels like a genuine attempt to make it seem like there were more people involved in the creation of these tracks than just Brian and Garry. The Buggy G Riphead name reappears, credited for profile control rather than simply artwork. He and all at Freaky Deep Records are thnacked, apparently, once again suggesting that a larger group of people working together. Freaky Deep was in fact a posited record label that they might start, but ended up simply being another aspect of the strange FSOL world. As Garry told Music Technology magazine in 1992, it's kind of like we're 2 guys here, it's not really that interesting, but with these different names we can pretend there's a bit of a scene down here. The Freaky Deep logo states, Pluto Boy meets Nanomagnetic, Freaky Deep Profile Control. A very 1991 set of words. More interesting is the logo next to it, a sphere surrounded by radiating diagonal lines with the words Earth Beat underneath it. Named after their studio, the Earth Beat logo would go on to grace almost every single release of theirs from this moment forth. With each release you can see the FSOL world growing bit by bit. Tim Jones reappears as executive producer for the first time since AST, perhaps suggesting that this was the first release since then to be recorded entirely at Earthbeat. And in full-on nerd territory, the release is notable for being the first time Cobain's first name appears as Garry with 2 R's. Ultimately, Pulse 2 feels like another bold step forward towards what we now recognise as the future sound of London. As the 3rd release in a row that would introduce important aspects of the wider FSOL approach, it feels like a part of a time of huge creativity for the band, and one that resulted in some of their best early material. No surprise that these EPs were compiled on CD in 2008. The future sound of London, Stolen Documents, Jazz Dub, also known simply as Stolen Documents. Track 2 from Accelerator and the 3rd ever FSOL track, a piece then that carried a fair amount of weight on it to help establish the moniker Dougans and Cobain had decided would be their key name, and it carries it well. As with Pulse State on the first EP, the level of detail in the production here is head and shoulders above most of what the band had released before. Breakbeats combined with house-tinged drum machine rhythms, jazzy electric piano chords improvised over a buzzing MKS-50 bassline, and most importantly a range of samples are deployed throughout to make the track as much a piece of textural listening music as it is dance floor fodder. As with Pulse State, the vibe is surprisingly laid back. When things begin to get intense, the track breaks down to something much smoother. Unusual reverb-laden sounds, loon samples, flutes and jazzy strings start bringing the mood back down to earth again. As with most of the FSOL tracks from the Jumpin' and Pumpin' era, after an initial EP release, labelled as Jazz Dub, Stolen Documents appeared on Accelerator without the mixed name. The only difference between the 2 versions is the loss of a few seconds each side, as the album version segues gaplessly into the tracks surrounding it. It's hard to speak objectively with the benefit of hindsight, but it may well have been obvious at the time that the future sound of London was the name to watch from all the different Earthbeat artists. A wonderfully sophisticated piece of what was briefly dubbed intelligent house, and a remarkably detailed track when you consider it came out only a few months after pieces like Issa's Flow. Brian considers Stolen Documents a turning point in the band's creative process, with the pair of them continuously swapping the track and writing new parts, hence previously unheard level of complexity. The electric piano improv is courtesy of Garry, and the beats are Brian's. Smart Systems Zip Code Stress Ball Mix. The first Smart Systems track lays out the general vibe of the project from the off. Big stabbing chords that could only ever feature on the hardcore end of UK rave music, a punchy breakbeat and some Hoover synths. The darkest sounding track they had created to date, Zip Code was the group embracing the sounds of 1991 with glee. Actually, despite its somewhat crude opening, Zip Code has a lot more to offer than one might think. Less than 2 minutes in, the rave elements largely disappear, leaving an uncharacteristically light and complex drum machine line, accompanied by atmospheric synth pads. The track suddenly runs into early IDM territory, a fitting piece for Warp's Artificial Intelligence series. The industrial rave machine reappears for the final 2 minutes, suggesting a more experimental piece bookended by a straightforward 4-minute hardcore track. It's a great example of how Dougans and Cobain were willing to push the boundaries of even the simplest musical styles. For the 2008 CD reissue, the track was edited by around a minute. This edit keeps the atmospheric midsection intact and cuts roughly 30 seconds each from the opening and closing rave parts. The future sound of London 1 in 8, also known as In8 WOW mix. As with other early FSOL 12-inch tracks, 1 in 8 features a range of sounds and a level of detail that marks it out as more sophisticated sounding than contemporary works by the likes of Smart Systems and Indo. Breakbeats, drum machines, numerous synth lines, acoustic percussion, male and female vocal samples, and a focus on texture, atmosphere and slower tempos, 1 in 8 fits in alongside its Pulse siblings like Pulse State and Stolen Documents. 1 in 8 does suffer more than most tracks in terms of an array of confusing versions. On the back of Pulse 2 it's listed as In 8 as one word, and on the sleeve it is In 8, the word and number, WOW mix. Some have questioned whether this means it was remixed by Way Out West, but the mix name is simply a reference to the Oh Wow vocal sample. Way Out West's first musical credit wasn't until over a year later. By the time the track appeared on Accelerator, its name had changed to 1 in 8. Indo Tribe, I've Become What You Were, Insider Mix. Rounding out the second Pulse EP is another returning artist name, Indo Tribe. Much like Mental Cube, there was never a key sound for Indo Tribe, and with no standalone releases to the name, there's a sense of it existing largely to mop up various uncategorisable tracks. Certainly, I've Become What You Were is a long way away in sound from the earlier epic techno of Bring in the Pulse and In the Mind of a Child. Instead, the track is led by a wonky, almost unmelodic synth line, which is met by numerous other oddly disjointed and unsettling synths, a lopsided rhythm track, and occasional bursts into breakbeats. I hated this track when I first heard it. Despite having a certain taste for odd sounds from a very young age, I've always reverted to emotive melodies for some reason, and after 3 very evocative tracks, I've Become What You Were leaps out as a generally unmelodic experimental piece. It took some time, but over the years I grew to really appreciate how genuinely strange this track is. I'm still not sure how well quite all the aspects work together, but it's totally unlike any other piece in the group's canon, and is, by some margin, the weirdest track they'd released by this point. Really worth tracking down if you've not heard it before. Trying to get information from Brian out of the track, I opened with, In the Mind of a Child, fucking weird track. His only response was, I agree. Intelligent Communication, Principles of Motion. Now this one's a bit different. Principles of Motion has become a bit of a fan favourite over the years, and a quick listen makes it easy to see why. The 4 bleepy, melodic, Detroit techno-inspired tracks on the EP stand head and shoulders above most of the group's debut and jumping and pumping material. What's surprising is that JMP were less keen, considering it unlikely to be successful. Admittedly, the tracks feel somewhat out of step in the UK rave scene of '91, albeit in a good way. The EP feels timeless, in a way that Indo Tribe and Smart Systems never really could. Throwing samples in among the melancholic melodies and interesting arrangements puts these tracks very close to FSOL of the era. The first three in particular hold their own against the likes of Pulse State and Stolen Documents, released around the same time. Still, the tracks didn't appear on Earthbeat or any of the Jumpin' and Pumpin' various artist compilations from the era, and the EP went on to be a bit of a cult favourite in FSOL circles. In response, in 2015, Principles of Motion was given a digital reissue on FSOL Digital, along with a series of newly recorded versions of Drive. 2022 saw the EP reissued again, remastered from the original DAT, and given a brand new vinyl pressing. This was the first Jumpin' and Pumpin' release outside Papua New Guinea and Stack of Humanoid to ever get a reissue. The cover, featuring what looks like a basic skeletal 3D rendering of a skyscraper, is the first Boogie image to look like it could have come from a Virgin Era FSOL album, bearing some similarity to images in the ISDN booklet. Boogie is credited for both artwork and, again, profile control, and the release is the second to mention the fictional Freaky Deak records. The Freaky Deak logo is present again next to the Earthbeat logo. Garry appears on the sleeve under his short-lived Cobain alias, while on the labels is still listed under his birth surname. FSOL are listed as producers for the first time, and Yage is once again absent. Drive. The opening track on Principles of Motion is probably its strongest, a brooding, bleak techno track complete with atmospheric pads and an absurdly catchy melody. The fairly laid-back breakbeat means it feels somewhat chilled in comparison with the UK dance scene at the time, possibly explaining Jumpin' and Pumpin's lack of confidence in the EP. Nevertheless, it stands up as one of the group's best of the era, falling much closer to the complexity and maturity of their early FSOL work than the usual Alias releases. Had it been released as FSOL, it would have been a strong contender for inclusion on Accelerator. Drive was briefly considered for performance at the band's 2009 live ISDN performances, and a new arrangement was rehearsed before the idea was dropped. A recording of one of these rehearsals was included as one of 4 new mixes of the track in 2015, a suggestion that the track is a favourite with the band as well as fans. Open Loop. Each side of the Principles of Motion EP features a dark, brooding track and a lighter, jazzier sounding one. Side A's lighter track is Open Loop, which begins with the same kind of jazzy chords that lead Stolen Documents, released shortly before. Very FSOL-ish flute samples leading to a much more melancholic second half, fading out with a sigh. The mixture of softer melodies with sharply electronic sounds, drum machines and breakbeats gives the track some similarity to second-wave Detroit techno artists from the time, such as Carl Craig. A long way from the more obvious UK dance sounds of the period, Open Loop is another track that could very happily have slotted in on the first side of Accelerator. Flight. More atmospheric melodic techno here. The drum machine hits slightly harder on this one, but the vibe is still pensive and mellow without a hint of rave or house music. Structurally, it's one of the band's finest of the era, gradually building and adding more elements as it goes on. The chords that come in at 2 minutes 20 are a particular highlight. As much as anything on this EP, Flight really highlights just how versatile Brian and Garry were, even at this early point in their career, managing to create beautiful, subtle techno track like this at the same time they were producing successful breakbeat hardcore as Smart Systems and house as Mental Cube. Critical Ebb. Principles of Motion closes on its warmest and mellowest track, led by a laid-back bongo line and jazzy major key synths. Unlike Side A's similar Open Loop, there's no diversion into melancholia halfway through, with the uplifting vibe running throughout. It's arguably the weakest of the EP's 4 tracks because of this. The lack of any real drama in the melodies makes it stand out less, but it's still a superb piece in its own right. I remember the first time I listened to Principles of Motion and I was really blown away. Even as someone who's always enjoyed most of their rave-oriented earlier material, the 4 tracks on this EP were clearly very special. I suppose that's the message I want to close this segment on. Not here's another melodic techno track by Intelligent Communication, but Brian and Garry have created some incredible, timeless music over the years, and this is a superb example of it. Yage, Indo Tribe, Smart Systems, Pulse 3. After the mellow melodic principles of motion, Dougans and Cobain returned to rave territory with the third in their Pulse series. Featuring two previous Pulse artists, Smart Systems and Indo Tribe, and the first track released under the Yage alias, the EP continued to develop the imaginary scene the band was creating at Earthbeat. Despite being the first Pulse EP not to include a track by FSOL, Yage's Calcium did end up being released on Accelerator under the FSOL name, a rare example of a piece existing under multiple aliases. Unsurprisingly, it's the most interesting track here. Tingler would go on to be the most famous Smart Systems piece, and after the band had regained some confidence in releasing singles, would be released as a 12-inch in its own right. Indo Tribe provide two tracks, typically pretty different from each other. Interestingly, Tingler and Owl were both born out of a different track that contained elements of both pieces. The Hoover sound came from the Roland MKS-50, the module version of the Alpha Juno 1, and the origin of this very familiar sound. Boogie's art follows the style of the second volume with explosive-looking grayscale computer imagery. The reverse cover features the now regular Freaky Deak and Earthbeat logos. The dubious mix names are present once again only on the labels, with the back cover suggesting these are simply original versions. Credit-wise, things are still somewhat jumbled. The sleeve has FSOL producing and engineering the whole EP, while the labels themselves cite Mental Cube, Yage and Luco as producers. And Tim Jones returns again as executive producer. Smart Systems Tingler 4x4 Mix, also known as Tingler Stateside Swamp Mix and Tingler Original. The weird world of early FSOL mix names. Throughout 91, almost every track released was dubbed something mix, regardless of whether it was the original version or not, or even whether other mixes were released. As such, Tingler appeared on Pulse 3 as the 4x4 mix, but by the time it came out in its own single, this was renamed Stateside Swamp Mix, and it only actually appeared as Tingler Original on the reissue in 2008. It is of course the most well-known Smart Systems track, probably because it was the only one to be released outside of a Pulse EP, and also because it was a huge success in the hardcore scene that UK raves had embraced wholeheartedly by this point in 91. All the hallmarks are there: sped up pounding breakbeats, synth stabs, hoovers all over the place, crowd noise. Not exactly the kind of track you're going to put on for home listening as often, but as UK hardcore went, it did the job marvellously. The other notable element of Tingler is the use of the From My Dreams So Beautiful sample, later used on Moscow, and the first time the band had sampled movie dialogue in one of their own tracks, a technique that would go on to be a staple of their sound. Incredibly, the track was played during the band's 2009 Athens concert, where it went down a storm. Indo Tribe, Owl. Yet another track that's confused people over the years, myself very much included, until FSOL board member Pandemonium picked up on it in his magnificent Panda Reviews thread in 2013. I was always under the impression that the version with rap sample was exclusive to the Breaks, Bass and Bleeps 3 compilation on which it appeared, but apparently not. This mix features on Pulse 3, but the version included on Earthbeat and bizarrely the Pulse EPs is instrumental, lacking the sample. With the most popular pirated download versions coming from digital sources, this became the most well-known mix. Owl combines Indo Tribe's earlier epic techno sound, think Bring in the Pulse, with the heavier breakbeats and crowd noise of 1991 hardcore. It's a dark, energetic piece with a pretty catchy melody and a ton of energy. I've always liked those early rave tracks with the big stabbing melodies like this, and it's been a personal favourite since I first heard it. Indo Tribe, Bite the Bullet Baby Jacques Renault mix. After a run of fairly complex and intriguing productions, it was only a matter of time before Brian and Garry went into big stupid dance track mode, and the result was Bite the Bullet Baby. The distorted synth melody and upbeat breaks are probably closer to Smart Systems than anything else released as Indo Tribe, although the project's always been a bit of a mishmash of sounds, and they give the track a fun, bouncy feel. It's quite astonishing to think that this was probably recorded around the same time as the material on Principles of Motion. While that EP was full of intricately programmed, creatively arranged pieces, Bite the Bullet Baby sets out with a synth and a breakbeat and then just runs with them for 4 minutes. No interesting breakdowns, atmospheric sections, surprise outros. Even the Twin Peaks sample, Jacques Renault saying the song's title, is robbed of its televisual unpleasantness, sounding like a novelty rave hit sample here. None of this is necessarily a criticism. Bite the Bullet Baby does its job brilliantly and proves that Brian and Garry could do big stupid dance tracks as well as anyone. But it really is strikingly simplistic in comparison with the pieces surrounding it. The track was faded out on the CD edition of Earthbeat for timing reasons. Yage Calcium Elemental Mix, also known as the Future Sound of London Calcium. As is usual for the FSOL track on a Pulse EP, Calcium is immediately more complex and dense than the tracks around it, especially following straight on from Bite the Bullet Baby. Of course, on first release it wasn't considered an FSOL track. Calcium Elemental Mix was credited to Yage. This was the first appearance of the name in a while and generally existed to continue the world building of the time. The track's less forthright beats, complex structure, wordless vocal samples and melancholic atmosphere all combined to make it perfect material for Accelerator, and the band had no issues with simply applying a new alias to the track. It's a good thing too, as Calcium is one of the best tracks on the album. A wonderfully evocative slice of experimental techno with layers of unusual sounds and percussion bubbling away beneath synth arpeggios and emotive piano chords. I'm talking about every version of Calcium combined here because apparently in the 30 plus years in its first release nobody seemed to have noticed that there are 3 different mixes of the track. Not only is the Elemental mix structurally different to the Accelerator version, but the version of the Elemental mix on 2008's Pulse EP's compilation is a separate take altogether. These aren't simply edits either, with the first halves of each track having their own unique arrangements, such as the piano coming in during different sections and different versions having different breakdown parts. The version on the Pulse EPs appears to be a different take entirely, with subtle differences in the 303 line. The second half of the track is identical on all 3 versions however. On screen you can see a screenshot of the 3 mixes, with the original Accelerator version with its extended intro added for completion. And that's it for this episode of Earthbeat Visions. I'd love to hear what you think of these pieces, so please drop a comment below, and as always, please subscribe to my channel and like and share the video. I'll be back next time with the second half of 1991, an era that starts with Tingler and ends with a little release called Papua New Guinea.